At last, we're going to take through a complete worked example of the application of the kind of neural networks we've seen in theorizing about human infant development. Hopefully you've read the paper at this stage. The paper is Schaffer and Marischal, Modeling Infant Speech Sound Discrimination Using Simple Associative Networks. The networks are very much in line with what we've seen here. The developmental questions are, of course, relatively new to us. This is connectionist work which comes, as it were, from outside the field of infant development studies and attempts to speak to it. And it builds on well-established results within a specific experimental paradigm that raise issues which it seems connectionist modeling is well positioned to address. What we're going to do is we're going to look first at the developmental results obtained by clinical psychologists. When we understand those, we're going to look at how the connectionist modelers set about creating a model in which they can point to something in the model and point to something in the situation of the experimental laboratory of the developmental psychologist with their experiments and map from one to the other. This is not to claim that things in the model are the same as things in the lab. They most certainly aren't. It's rather to suggest that there are, as it were, high-level structural similarities which revolve around the important underlying questions which the psychologists are interested in. This is a very good example to look at, not because it changed the course of anything. It's a good example to look at because it makes manifest the obligations of the modeler. It shows how and in what way modeling attempts to speak to the concerns of a specific theoretical group. And it shows you how much both the work of the theoretical psychologist and the connectionist modeler rely and make no sense without their fundamental commitments to certain equivalences, which you may choose to refuse or not. So let's get going. Stager and Verker did the original work in the developmental, the infant lab. And they were looking at the relationship between word learning and speech sound discrimination. In the experiments in which we'll be following, infants were doing a very specific task. They were learning not words, but word-image combinations. I say image because it's been taken somehow as unproblematic that showing someone an image of something is functionally equivalent to showing them the thing itself. It's a bit weird. It's not our problem. What they did was they trained infants at 8 months and at 14 months with novel words, blork, for example, and novel images of types. And they habituated them, we'll explore that in a minute, to the association until the point at which showing the sound and showing the image was equivalent and boring. On switch trials after the habituation phase, what they would do is they would change the sound somewhat. And if the infant was just as bored after the sound change as before, then they would say the infant didn't notice the change. And if the infant showed renewed interest in the combination, then they said, the infant must have spotted the change. Now, working with infants is difficult. With very young infants, you tend to, one standard methodology is to use a dummy and to use their sucking rate as a proxy for interest. When we say as a proxy, you should always see that with a question mark and say, that's a bit odd. Is that a good index of the other? These are slightly older, 8-month and 14-month-old infants, and they're going to use the looking time as a proxy for interest. So habituation in the original developmental work looks like this. The visual objects are shown on a monitor, so an image, and the word is presented over a loudspeaker below the monitor. The word-object pairs are repeated in random order until the infant is familiarized with the pairings, and they do this in pairs of association, so 2 images and 2 sounds. At some stage, the infant gets bored and stops looking at the damn thing, as you might understand. And this is taken as a sign that the infant is now habituated. Thereafter, trials either contain a switch in the sound or not a switch. And if there is an increase in looking time on a switch trial compared to a non-switch trial, that is taken as an index of novelty. So here's a further number we can calculate. The difference between the looking time on switch trials and looking time on same trials operationalizes what they call the difference in habituation. This is a construct. You can see clearly this is constructed carefully. We've decided we're going to use looking time. We've decided we're going to measure looking time in one way or another. That itself is not straightforward. And we're going to use the difference between looking time in these 2 conditions to draw inferences about the degree to which the child has internalized an association between the sound and the object. Now in Stager and Verker there are 4 experiments. Experiment 1 is a little peculiar it uses a slightly different structure from the others, so I'm not going to really talk about that. But experiment 2 is the very central one, where having formed an association with, for example, B and a particular image, 8-month-olds will show surprise when the same image is presented with a different sound, D. Now, B and D are very similar. They differ only in one phonological feature, which is the place of articulation. 14-month-olds, who are so much wiser and clever, don't exhibit this surprise. They don't seem to be phased or to even notice the switch from B to D. This is taken as an index of non-monotonicity. That means that learning doesn't just follow an upward going trajectory, but that it advances and retreats, because it looks on the face of it as if the 14-month-olds are failing to do something that they could do at 8. I say fail, and I want you to very much mistrust that word, because of course the 14-year-olds are not trying to pass any tests. Anyway, in experiment 3, we have an important control condition where we make the difference between the sounds simply larger. So lif and neem, for example, is much larger. There's 3 sound differences there compared with bit and di. And 14-month-olds get that. That is to say, you make a switch like that and they notice it. They had another control condition, and we'll be coming back to this one, in which they tried to make this a sound-only task, but they've set up a structure in which sounds are paired with images. And so what they did was they presented something which is and is not an image. It's a checkerboard pattern. The idea being to make it uninterpretable, so that it's not so much the sound object association that the infant is assumed to be learning, but simply the sound. And 14-month-olds get this as well. So it's not that the 14-month-olds are incapable of discriminating between bit and di. They most certainly are. So here's the results. And the y-axis here is the average looking time. If that's longer on a switch trial with the stripy bars than on a same trial, that's the solid bars, then we're seeing an effect. So there, for example, in the second experiment, the 8-month-olds looked longer on a switch trial than the same trial, and the developmental psychologist infers from this that they are sensitive to the switch that went on. The 14-month-olds in the same experiment do not display this difference, and the developmental psychologist infers that they are insensitive to the switch. If the sounds are more distinct, lif neem, then the 14-month-olds can clearly discriminate them. And then in the checkerboard paradigm, where there's an image that's a non-image, they can tell them apart as well. So these set up the game, as it were. Why is this so interesting? Well, here we have to acknowledge that we're taking Stager and Werker's interpretation of things. They designed this experiment. They made many choices along the way. Many of these proxies where looking time correlates with their underlying ideas of an inner economy of the baby, and so on. So here we're dealing with Stager and Werker's account. They say 8-month-old infants are learning fine phonetic detail. They're novices in the language. And there you need to pay attention to language-specific contrasts if you're ever going to learn the phonology. From their point of view, 14-month-old infants seem to have finished that stage and are going on to do a different task. A bit like moving from primary to secondary school. You've got your fine phonetic detail down. Now you're learning the good stuff. Word-referent relations, learning to name things in the world. They say that this is a different task which biases the perceptual system differently, and that this accounts for the difference that we see. So there's a qualitative distinction between what the 8-month-olds are doing and what the 14-month-olds are doing. And Stager and Werker use this to suggest a functional reorganization of the language system sometime in that window between 8 months and 14 months. Now, we haven't gone into this in any detail in this class, but at this time, well, and still to the present, one very important landmark in considerations of infant and child development is Jean Piaget, the French infant developmental psychologist, who was very fond of suggesting stages in development. Piaget's idea of a developing child is much like the idea of how a sunflower seed comes to be a sunflower and eventually to produce seeds again. If you plant a sunflower seed and you're interested in the sunflower, there's a certain set of stages you have to go through. You can't short circuit any of them. So the seed has to first germinate, and we get the little green leaves coming out, and then a stalk comes up, and then leaves come up, and then we get a flower, and eventually the flower will generate more seeds. And you can't skip any stage in that. This is the explanatory model that Piaget used and was very, very influential, and still is. It's also somewhat problematic as it assumes everything is internal and isolated from the world. But when you think in those terms about infant development, you can design operationalizations, tests, which when administered to a young cohort produce a different result from those administered to a later cohort. You could design an infinity of such tests. And every time someone does and they document such a distinction, there are claims like this made, that there's a functional reorganization of the language system. This kind of explanation is a red rag to connectionist researchers. In reading the summary of the book Rethinking Innateness, you will have found the argument that the constructive nature of this experimentation may be misleading, and it may be the case that the infant is just approaching the world with a single spirit, as it were, and that in interaction with the world, learning proceeds perhaps non-monotonically by your index, but that there's no necessary need to posit a functional reorganization within the child. So this is where Schaffer and Marischal come in. The change in behavior needs to be understood. The behavior is artificial. The behavior has been designed. When the behavior occurs in a context that has been engineered and designed with specific choices that represent the theoretical preoccupations of the researchers, there are no natural kinds involved here. What the connectionist contribution sets out to do then, Schaffer and Marischal, is to demonstrate that the change in behavior observed in the laboratory doesn't necessarily require a change in the underlying processing mechanism or strategy. So there doesn't have to be distinct functional stages. but it's a lot of work to get to the stage that you can speak to this. This is the point they wish to address in their modeling. But it's very much not straightforward to make this kind of neural network modeling relevant to those kinds of considerations. And so they present a method for modeling the kind of habituation phenomena that were demonstrated here by the 8-month and 14-month-old infants. And they use then their model to make some predictions. Now, the theoretical issues here are important. Depending on whether we acknowledge or believe in the idea of a functional reorganization of the language system, different consequences follow. Piaget's stage-wise development model has been extremely important in establishing norms for use within education systems, in schools, in designing curricula, and in establishing the borders between what we might consider normal development and abnormal development. So the degree to which one believes in such functionally distinct stages has very, very real-world commitments that matter in how we design the systems in which our children are raised. So I want you to see a couple of things here. One is that the link between the observations of the psychologists and the theoreticians and so on to the underlying infant is weak as hell. Very, very weak. And yet the issues matter. So the manner in which we conduct this work really, really matters. We will see a lot of things to wonder about as we go along. Both Stager and Werker and Schaffer and Marshall work with the following sorts of assumptions. That the experimental vehicle set up by the developmental psychologists presents us with a framework in which we will interpret the infant. And in this framework, when the infant is presented with an image of an object, never with an object, just an image of an object, then the infant will compare what it sees with an internal representation. And if there's a mismatch, if this is something novel, then there'll be some kind of internal churn in which internal representations are modified and the infant is altered by the experience. If, however, the thing presented is a yawner, has been seen too often before, then it's not of interest, the infant won't pay attention. So the greater the mismatch, the more attention the infant will pay. There's so much to critique on this. This is not a necessary interpretation of infant behaviors under any circumstances. It's not even a necessary interpretation of infant behavior under the laboratory circumstances, but it provides the common assumptions of the developmental psychologists and the connectionist modelers. So they share these assumptions. Now, enter the network. It's an autoassociator. We've met autoassociators. Autoassociators are very, very simple. They look nothing like infants. Nothing, not even a bit. They're bunches of the same kind of stupid computational units that we've been looking at all along, arranged in a network, a feed-forward network, in which the input layer and the output layer have the same number of units. In between is a hidden layer, which has less units. And the task of the network, trained using backpropagation, is to reproduce the input at the output, passing through this hiatus, this bottleneck of the hidden layer. Now, this looks nothing like an infant. And so some associations have to be made between things in the network and what are hopefully theoretically important things in our characterization of the real world. I want you to see the artifice in this. I want you to be clear that this is not an infant, and when we derive results from it, we're relying on identifications we've made that one could make or one could refuse. So the number of training cycles that this needs to reduce error in its task of reproducing the output at the input is taken by the connectionist modelers as a proxy for the development of an internal representation. Even less obviously, the error that we observe at the output is taken as a proxy for the looking time of the infant. So in the developmental psychology lab, we've got this non-trivial decision to pay attention and try to measure looking time in the infant. Here we're taking network error, which looks nothing like looking time, and we're going to equate the two, but it varies quantitatively, and we'll see how this is used now. Now there's a further very important distinction between an infant and a network. One is the infant has been around for a while, 8 months or 14 months, and in that time it has been learning language. So we need in our networks to find a difference between 8-month-old infants and 14-month-old infants. There's no infants in the network. So what they do is they first have a period which we're going to call, implausibly, language exposure. And we're going to have two classes of networks, one of which is trained on 1,000 label object pairs. The number of label object pairs is 240 throughout. The younger networks, the 8-month-old networks as it were, are trained on 1,000 epochs, 1,000 passes through this data set. The so-called older networks are trained on 10,000 passes through this network. That's a qualitative difference between a network that has some training and a network that has a great deal more training. That's all you can say about this. The metric of months doesn't work, but we have a young-old sort of distinction. Then, having trained the networks in this way on the autoassociative task, there's an experimental phase in which both the habituation phase and the testing phase find their representation in the connectionist model. It's bizarre, isn't it? It's a lot of bending over backwards to take set concepts from the network domain and use them to refer to concepts from the construction of the interpretation of the infant psychologist. The infant, meanwhile, is left out of this. Now, there's a lot of detail that still matters in what goes on, and that's the point of taking this. We want to see what the detail is. Now, we said that we've got a network that has input patterns and output patterns. What are those patterns? Well, remember, in the infant laboratory, the child was presented with an image of an object and with a sound. Now, networks don't have images or sounds or anything like that. They just do sums. So we are going to present vectors at the input, in which the input units are divided into two groups, one group of which will have numbers that we are going to put in some correspondence to images, and one group of which has numbers that we are going to put in correspondence to sounds. So we're going to encode, that is, we're going to design a mapping from the numbers we use to sounds and from the numbers we use to images. Let's see how that goes and whether we believe that mapping. Well, sounds we've met before. We looked at the representations in Net Talk, and we're going to use something very, very similar here. There's going to be 18 input units for representing the three sounds. So B and D are each three, and Lif and Neen. These are all actually three sound combinations, if B and D are taken to have a H at the end. So we're going to devote 18 units for the sounds. That's 6 units for each of the three sounds. And there we're going to use phonological features, as we've met before, in which each 1 or 0 distinguishes between sounds which are, for example, consonant or vowel, voiced or voiceless, stop or fricative, labial or made further back in the mouth. We've seen this before in Net Talk. We've seen that phonology provides us with a way of organizing the domain, what we know about the domain of contrasting speech sounds. We've met the International Phonetic Alphabet before, and we've met this idea that within the phonological system of a language, individual phonemes, or minimally contrasting sound units, are defined by their oppositions to other elements. So being voice is the opposite of being voiceless, and so on. And in this way, we get this imposition of structure on the domain. One is either a vowel or a consonant, but not both or neither. This is the basic move of the larger scientific movement called structuralism, which abstracts away from the messiness of life to try to find domains that exhibit this kind of structure. So we have some theory here, and we've explored this in Net Talk before, so we have some idea how we might represent sounds. How are we going to represent images? We're going to have 18 units. That's 18 numbers. And what the hell is an image? And as I said, the experimenters keep talking about presenting the child with an object, but they're never presented with an object. They're presented with an image of an object. And we have 18 numbers. We're not going to get very far, are we? How do you represent the possible set of monsters and toys and surprises with 18 numbers? And then represent the fact that there's no meaningful way to do that. So what they do is they choose random 18-bit vectors and say, there, that's a thing. A thing devoid of any meaning whatsoever. Bear in mind, a toy monster will have big eyes and maybe scary fangs. A random 18-bit vector doesn't have any of that. So they've given up here. They're going to use a random 18-bit vector and say that's a thing. And in the experimental manipulation, that is when we go from habituation to switch trials, the only change that's to be made is to the sound area. So we'll be presenting the same random 18-bit vector. Notice that the world of the child here has been evacuated of all meaning. All meaning has been sucked out of it. One of the experimental conditions requires something which was an image and was not an image. The structure of the experiment required that there be something on the screen, but they wanted to make it an auditory-only task, so they presented a checkerboard pattern which couldn't be interpreted as any determinate object. What are we going to do here? Well, they did the following. They checked the corresponding 18-bit vector for the checkerboard pattern simply has all bits set to 0.5, so it's minimally interesting, as it were. And having done all this work, we now have all the means in place, and you can go back to the paper to check the details, but we have the means in place to reproduce in the network the various experimental conditions from the original Stager and Werker work. So by training networks initially, we've got two classes of networks, young networks and old networks. We then set up the notion of the trial, in which we present a habituation phase in which error decreases as the association between a sound and an image is learned, or rather as an 18-bit vector is reproduced at the outside, and then we make a change to the 18-bit vector and we look to see, is there a change in the output? So that means that you can obtain results that look rather like the original results. So on the bottom right here, we have the original infant results, and the y-axis here is the mean looking time of the infants. We went through these data before. The top left is the network results, and the y-axis here is the mean error at the output, the root mean squared error at the output. Very, very different variable. Notice, first of all, the astonishingly good match between the experimental results on the network and the experimental results on the infant data. When you see something like this, you should have your safety goggles, knee pads, hard hat on, and you should approach it with extreme caution. The stunningly good match here is an entire construction. There were so many choices along the line, none of the metric choices, that the apparent similarity between these two graphs is something that has been engineered, and you should see that directly. Networks are not children, they're just doing sums, and there are further hoops to be jumped through in order to interpret the network as being relevant to the child's situation. So, for example, the index of novelty in the children is the change in looking time. In the network, it's a change in error. The change in looking time was interpreted by the psychologists using the standard statistical weapons of the psychologists, testing for statistical significance at p less than 0.05. Amen. The network error has no significance test in it. So in order to reproduce, for example, the qualitative difference between the performance of the 14-month-old infants on bit dip versus lift neem, we can take the index of novelty, which is the continuously varying measure of error, and apply a threshold and say if the threshold is below this, then the network is not responding to the change, the network didn't notice the change, and if it's above a threshold, then the network did notice the change. Notice how fanciful those elaborations are from the actual network. So this seems to demonstrate the non-monotonicity. So if you look at the x-axis here is the number of language trials, these are the pre-exposure trials. And what you see is that from the start, the index of novelty is quite high for both bit-dip contrast and lift-neem contrast. Over time, however, the index of novelty for the bit-dip contrast dips beneath the threshold, and so there's an apparent reversal. It's not that these have moved to a different functional stage. What's happened is that the amount of interest generated has dropped beneath the threshold. As awkward as it is, and this is definitely awkward, this is the connectionist modeler's account to articulate, in the language of connectionism, a distinction or an account of what is going on, which challenges the interpretation of the developmental psychologists about functional stages in development. What they've actually done is trained an autoassociator, learning pairs of patterns, and they showed some kind of non-monotonic development if you interpret everything in just the right way. And so using the network, they have seem to have produced an apparent behavioral change despite having only one underlying processing mechanism and with no explicit correspondence in their simulation for a functional reorganization. Now, there were very many ad hoc choices along the way. We've seen many of the ad hoc choices made by the network modelers. So the threshold of 20%, the young versus old, 1,000 trials versus epochs versus 10,000 epochs. There were lots and lots of choices that were arbitrary. They were motivated. They were motivated, but they are not metric, of course. There's no sense in which you can map 1,000 onto 8 months and 10,000 onto 14 months. So that should make the relative similarity of those plots very, very suspicious indeed. To what extent does this simulation relate at all to what the infant is doing? The developmental psychologist understands the infant to be learning word-object associations. The autoassociator has these vectors, which we constructed in using our phonological knowledge and more or less giving up on any image structure. So there's a lot of reason to think that the connectionist modeling, while it speaks to the concerns of the developmental psychologist, contains rather a lot of constructive work that is difficult to relate back to the underlying world of the infant. Now, the developmental psychologists themselves, they have made similar choices in operationalizing and setting up the task and designing the association between display of an image and blasting sound at the child. They have decided and made very many similar choices in order to describe the child. The child has been left out. So I guess I want you, from this now detailed example, I want you to distinguish between the roles of the developmental psychologists with their choices, constructive activities and presuppositions, the network modeler with their choices, their presuppositions, and the infant who's curiously not involved in all this. That is, the infant is being interpreted but is not really... I lament the absence of the actual infant and its life world in here. But each of these, the psychologist, the connectionist, and the infant, play very different roles, and they don't all necessarily understand things in comparable ways. There's a lot of food for thought in this example, I hope. It purports to speak to a theoretically very, very important point that has real-world consequences. When you look at it in detail, many, many bits of this argument are open to challenge. This is entirely typical of work done in the domain. And we need work done in the domain. We need to be able to engage robustly with the assumptions, for example, of the developmental psychologist and challenge presuppositions like there must be a functional reorganization. Maybe we've demonstrated that there didn't have to be a functional reorganization. But as you can see, things are anything but straightforward.